Since October the 7th, Israel has bombed Gaza with historic intensity. In the first 2 months of its campaign, Israel says it has conducted 10,000 airstrikes. That's one airstrike for every 220 Palestinians living in the territory. And according to researchers at CUNY Graduate Center and the University of Oregon, more than 60% of buildings in northern Gaza have been severely damaged. In some areas, that rises to 70%. Across the whole of Gaza, up to 105,000 buildings have been destroyed. Homes, mosques, churches, health centers, and schools obliterated. We can compare that level of bombing to the campaigns waged against German cities by Allied forces in World War II. This graph is from the Financial Times. At the high end, estimates for the proportion of buildings more than 50% damaged in Gaza stands at 68%. If that's right, it's more than the 59% of buildings that were destroyed in Dresden and the 61% bombed in Cologne. Only Hamburg suffered higher damage at 75%. This level of destruction has only been made possible by Israel's sophisticated weapons cache, largely furnished by Western arms manufacturers. Israel doesn't reveal the nature of its weapons, but explosive analysts working for the Financial Times have identified many of its arms by analysing photographs released by the IDF on a daily basis. Some of those weapons are relatively precise. This helicopter is firing a Hellfire missile made by US arms firm Lockheed Martin. These laser-guided explosives were used by the US against ISIS militants in Iraq and Syria. Israel has used them in densely populated Gaza. Also being used are so-called fire and forget spike missiles. They're developed by an Israeli arms firm and are locked onto a target before being fired, hence you can forget them after they have been fired. But Israel is also using much heavier unguided explosives. So the M117 bomb being detonated here is an unguided weapon dropped from a plane. It weighs 750 pounds. It was developed by the US military and has been in use since the Korean War in the 1950s. Now, the FT's military analysts suspect they're falling on Gaza too. But the heaviest weapon in Israel's arsenal is the 2,000-pound GBU-31 bomb. This footage is from Afghanistan in 2012 and shows 2 of these bombs exploding.
I don't really know. How far is it going to hit? Oh my God! Everything is gone. God! I can't even zoom out any farther. There is nobody in there. That's the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life.
That's what Israel has reportedly been dropping on Gaza. Developed by US arms manufacturer Boeing, GBU-31 bombs are 4 times larger than the biggest weapons the US used on the Iraqi city of Mosul. Combined with global positioning systems that turns them into JDAMs, that's Joint Direct Attack Munitions, their force is immense. And Israel hasn't been using them sparingly. Former Pentagon military analyst Mark Garlasco told the Financial Times this about the bomb's effects. Buildings pancake. Their support disintegrates, so they collapse in on themselves. And then there are the area effects, including the secondary fragmentation of cement, metal, people's cell phones, and everything else that flies out from the explosion at supersonic speeds. The only reason I can think of why they have been used is that the IDF has been trying to collapse Hamas's tunnel network. What is remarkable, though, is their widespread use. So that's pretty terrifying. They are trying to destroy what's under the ground, and if it's going to reach what's under the ground, they're going to destroy a hell of a lot of what's on the ground, right? If you're trying to damage a tunnel, you're going to damage the building to a much greater extent than whatever is under it. Blast survivors have described the bomb's force as making it feel like they were, quote, surfing liquid earth. And earlier this week, Amnesty released this investigation. They found that US-made JDAM bombs killed 43 civilians in 2 Israeli airstrikes and have called for the attacks to be investigated as war crimes. And that's only what Amnesty has been able to investigate, as no journalists or investigators are allowed into Gaza. It could be months until we find out the full extent of the munitions they used, if ever, of course. And there's another aspect of Israel's bombing campaign which is clouded in secrecy: how they decide where to drop their bombs. But an investigation by left-wing Israeli magazine 972 has spoken to sources who have given us at least some idea. Based on conversations with 7 current and former Israeli intelligence officers, 972 reports this. Compared to previous Israeli assaults on Gaza, the current war, which Israel has named Operation Iron Swords and which began in the wake of the attacks on October 7th, has seen the army significantly expand its bombing of targets that are not distinctly military in nature. These include private residences, as well as public buildings, infrastructure, and high rise blocks, which sources say the army defines as power targets. The bombing of power targets, according to intelligence sources who had first hand experience with its application in Gaza in the past, is mainly intended to harm Palestinian civil society, to create a shock that, among other things, will reverberate powerfully and lead civilians to put pressure on Hamas, as one source put it. That sounds a lot like collective punishment. One source to 972 said this: "Nothing happens by accident. When a 3-year-old girl is killed in a home in Gaza, it's because someone in the army decided it wasn't a big deal for her to be killed. That it was a price worth paying in order to hit another target. We are not Hamas. These are not random rockets. Everything is intentional. We know exactly how much collateral damage there is in every home." A second source who took part in previous offences in Gaza told 972 this: "We are asked to look for high-rise buildings with half a floor that can be attributed to Hamas. Sometimes it is a militant group's spokesperson's office or a point where operatives meet. I understood that the floor is an excuse that allows the army to cause a lot of destruction in Gaza. That is what they told us. If they would tell the whole world that the Islamic Jihad offices on the 10th floor are not important as a target, but that its existence is a justification to bring down the entire high rise with the aim of pressuring civilian families who live in it in order to put pressure on terrorist organizations, this would itself be seen as terrorism. So they do not say it." Israel has, of course, bombed Gaza many times before, but it's never attacked with the ferocity we're seeing in this bombardment. In 2021, the IDF attacked 1,500 targets in 11 days. In 2014, around 6,000 targets were bombed over 51 days. But in the current assault, 15,000 targets were destroyed in just the first 35 days of the war. So why are there so many more so-called targets now than there have been in previous bombardments? Now, the answer may be that Israel is using a target-generating AI system called Habsora. Now, that means the gospel in Hebrew. It's capable of producing up to 100 targets per day. The 972 investigation reports this. Habsora, explained one of the sources, processes enormous amounts of data that tens of thousands of intelligence officers could not process and recommends bombing sites in real time. Because most senior Hamas officials head into underground tunnels with the start of any military operation, the sources say, the use of a system like Habsora makes it possible to locate and attack the homes of relatively junior operatives. One former intelligence officer explained that the Habsora system enables the army to run a mass assassination factory in which the emphasis is on quantity and not on quality. A human eye will go over the targets before each attack, but it need not spend a lot of time on them. Since Israel estimates that there are approximately 30,000 Hamas members in Gaza and they are all marked for death, the number of potential targets is enormous. The number of potential targets may be enormous. But so too are the number of civilians being caught up in the carnage. 16,500 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza in the last 2 months, 7,000 of them children, according to the health ministry. Only a fraction of them, between 1 and 3,000, according to the Israeli military, I think they're now saying 5,000, but I don't really believe that, have been armed Hamas fighters. This Financial Times report sort of stunned a lot of people with those comparisons between Gaza and Dresden, because Dresden is often sort of put forward as, the dark side of the Allied forces' war in the Second World War. So, it's not obvious. It's very obvious what side to take in that battle. That was one of the few wars where we can say, yes, that was a just war, right? The Allies had to do everything they could to defeat the Nazis. But many military historians and sort of lawyers of international law think that probably the mass bombing of Dresden and the mass killing of civilians might not have been necessary, and therefore, retrospectively, they've drawn up the legal sort of parameters of war so that Dresden doesn't happen again. But Israel is doing Dresden plus, because Dresden was over quite a long period of time that we were bombing that city. This has been a few weeks, and you're seeing more damage than you ever saw then. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, Michael, you read out some stats earlier. Nearly 17,000 Palestinians have been killed. 7,000 of these are children. These are horrific stats. Also 85% of the population in Gaza have been displaced. 9 in 10 people have access to inadequate food. So this is a dark situation. And the problem we have here is the liberal consensus is to assume Israel is acting in good faith. So Israel is acting in its defense, right? Israel has a right to defend itself. We've heard this phrase said time and time again. But this is not about defending itself. This is about the indiscriminate targeting of civilians. Yeah, we've seen this when you read those stats out, Michael. These are horrific stats. And I think ultimately what we need in this moment is principled politicians in the West acting, with courage and with compassion. These are people who are suffering. I've been struck on social media seeing so many influential Palestinians essentially tweet their last words. You're seeing horrible scenes in Gaza day in and day out, and we should not be numb to this. And I think, people on the left who've done a really amazing job in terms of turning out to the streets in large numbers, and people, not just on the left, people in general with compassion have turned out in large numbers to these protests. And I think it's important we continue to put pressure on governments in the West, because this kind of liberal consensus that assumes that Israel's acting in good faith is completely ridiculous. Israel's not acting in good faith at the moment. Israel is quite literally targeting civilians in Gaza indiscriminately. It's a war crime, and people, leaders who claim to espouse these kind of liberal values of human rights and protecting civilians should be speaking out against this. And what they say often is, as you mentioned earlier, Michael, is there seems to be a disconnect between what they say and what they do. So it's like, oh no, we want to protect Palestinians. Of course we care about their lives, but then they do nothing about it. So I think it's important for these leaders who espouse these liberal values to actually stand by them and act on them.